the property management industry, fair housing offenses are considered especially troubling. In the United States, a dedicated fair housing attorney, Leslie Tucker, provides case explanations and best practices. These are some cases.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Fair Housing Insiders Case Files, Episode 6 with Leslie Tucker, the principal at Williams, Edelstein, and Tucker. I'm your host, Jonathan Saar. The case that we're talking about today is full of parking lot problems. So, Leslie, can you share with us how this housing provider is accused of falling short of approving not one, but many reasonable accommodation requests for an assigned accessible parking space?
Yeah, Jonathan, thanks. This case was filed on behalf of a condominium owner whose name is Dr. Adams. She is paraplegic, and the case is filed against her condo association and the management company. Dr. Adams drives a specially modified van that enables her to enter and exit on the passenger side via a ramp that unfolds. And the ramp requires at least 8 feet on that side in order to be able to unfold and for her to enter and exit. The minimum required space for a van accessible space is 8 feet. Imagine that. Mm-hmm. So compare that to a standard accessible space where the clearance on the side is only 5 feet. So van accessible spaces have additional clearance, and that's exactly the purpose of that additional clearance. So when Dr. Adams purchased her condominium, she was assigned a non-accessible parking space within the parking garage. Obviously, she was not able to use that. So prior to moving in, she spoke to the management agent and asked if she could maybe get in touch with some of her neighbors to see if she could arrange to swap spaces with them, kind of informally, who maybe had additional clearance on the side of their space. Mm-hmm. Allegedly, there was no response to that request. Later in the month, it's alleged that Dr. Adams followed up multiple times on that request and said, hey, can I be assigned my own accessible space? And the agent basically said, look, everything is assigned and already deeded to other condo owners, so that won't be possible. The management company did do a couple of things, though, in order to try to accommodate her, I guess, for what they thought would be effective, which is that they would give her access to all of the different levels of the parking deck, so she could drive around and find an available accessible space that was open. That was apparently an exception, and not everyone has access to all the different levels, so they were kind of making an exception in this way. They also changed their parking rules that made sure that everyone was, strictly showing their parking placard if you're going to park in an accessible space, and that you couldn't just leave your car sitting in an accessible space for a long period of time. So the problem, allegedly, with these solutions was that Dr. Adams said that she would circle around and around for hours, waiting and looking for available accessible parking spaces. She says that she had to eat dinner in her car multiple times, waiting for a space to open up because she literally could not exit her vehicle without, a van accessible space. She made multiple more attempts to get one assigned, but ultimately was told that the condominium could not prioritize her over other disabled residents who also parked in accessible spaces, and giving her a reserved accessible space would essentially kind of give her priority or special treatment over them. She did file a fair housing complaint, and the condo did eventually assign her a van accessible space, but it wasn't until after that complaint was filed. A lawsuit followed that, and it is now ongoing.
Okay. That's an intriguing dialogue between the resident and the association there. So there's one point that you mentioned as you were explaining it about the placard. So was there any merit to that argument that housing providers cannot assign accessible spaces since they're intended to be used by anyone with a parking placard?
Well, those accessible spaces that are located on the properties, yes, they are intended to be used by anyone, by any resident that has a parking placard. However, you really can't have a policy that you will never assign those spaces, because sometimes there are circumstances where someone needs a reserved space. This may have been one of those situations, because of the hardship that she experienced in finding an open space. In this case, there were 19 total accessible spaces, but only 4 of those were van accessible spaces, and those are the only spaces she could use. So, although you can ask people to, park wherever you can find an accessible space, in some instances, in other instances, you may need to reserve a space just for one person if they are experiencing a hardship like this and if they absolutely need it in order to live there.
Okay, understood. So do you think this would have been different, this situation, if Dr. Adams only required a standard accessible space rather than a van accessible space?
I think that's possible, Jonathan, because part of the hardship that she was experiencing was the lack of van accessible spaces. Did they have a compliant number? Probably they did. So that's not really the issue. But if she just needed a standard accessible space, there were a lot more of those available. And it's possible that she could have found one to park in using her placard and not experienced a hardship with that. So I do think part of her personal experience did relate to her needing a van accessible space and feeling like, her needs were not being heard and not being met by the condominium association. At least that's what was alleged.
Got it. Yeah, intriguing case. A lot of lessons learned. And I know for our audience, our property management companies who look at this, and my takeaways are not only your policies, but just the communication. It just, like you said, allegedly, there seemed to be a lot of communication gaps going on with this particular situation. So thank you very much for your explanation. And thank you everyone for tuning into our show. We appreciate you as an audience. So we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.
Thanks.